Hello, my name is Chris Barrington-Leigh. I wish I could be there with you today in Vancouver to get your direction and questions as I go. But I'm going to hang out in the bottom of your screen for a while, and I look forward to joining you live shortly. My aim is to tell you a little bit about the modern measurement of subjective well-being, and to explain why people are increasingly using life satisfaction as an overall overarching measure of human well-being in levels from neighborhoods up to nations. Here are my ideas of how we might, in principle, be making big picture policy decisions, or small ones for that matter. But in principle, here are several different ways that we might go about doing that. And the first is really the mindset of economics, and that is that we believe that we will have enough information if we just look at the decisions that we see people make and infer from those decisions, from those choices, what is good for people. And so it turns out if you think along those lines, you decide that giving people more choice is better. Of course, you're focused largely on the measurable decisions. Many of those are in the market. And you quickly get to a convenient kind of measure that if you maximize market income, you will be maximizing people's choices, and that's a decent measure of how well off people are. Now, a very different approach would be to go around and ask people what they believe is good for life or for society. Okay, so what makes for a good life? And use people's opinions in some way in order to direct your priorities. Now, in fact, we do something similar wherever you see people having created indices, such as you may be familiar with the UN Human Development Index, which is essentially a list of a few measures that people and domains in life that people think are important, and indeed they are. But the problem is that it's probably not a complete list, and that the weight is not arbitrary between those things. Some of them may be more important than others in some sense. And so it's very difficult. Well, that's one. And so you have a problem coming up with an index like the HDI does, based on a limited set with unknown weights. But I hope within a few minutes you will also see another problem, which is that people actually may be mistaken about which things will make them happier. Not just societal level conditions, but even their own future outcomes from options that are at their own hands. The third method we could adopt, which is the one I'm going to focus on today, is to ask people a much more complex question, but a simpler to understand in some sense, and that is to ask people how good life feels, to ask them how satisfied they are with life altogether. And the beauty of this, one of them, is that all of these problems about choosing, well, which things matter, which things are important, and how much does each matter, we lay entirely the burden of that on each and every individual as they answer the question. So people are entirely free to have different values, different priorities in life, think different things are salient to a good life, and have different standards for accomplishing those things. And we ask them in nearly the blink of an eye to do this calculation for themselves, where anything that's important gets added up and evaluated against their own set of ideals. This question is also nice because it's a single question, and so then we leave the rest of the, after that we have a single value, a single number from each respondent, and we can now have work with the distribution of those responses, or the average of those responses, or so on. And really this is much easier to understand even the aggregate data because of its simplicity. We now have decades of work using such data so that we have a good understanding of how people are making these calculations. And we also have now a large body of these data. So there are now millions of individuals who respond to these questions in international surveys, national surveys, local surveys. Now, I am going to focus on life satisfaction, but I need to mention that there are other measures of subjective well-being. And we only think of maybe 3 categories. One other category is affective states. And in fact, there are a few people, Danny Kahneman is among them, who think that these should be the focus of an overarching, say, policy-related societal progress metric. An affective state or an emotional state, this is a much more short-term feeling and emotion, and of course these tend to reflect more they tend to be more labile, they tend to reflect more the short-term conditions and changes in life. So you can think there how much time you're spending with happy feelings or unhappy feelings. And again, we now have lots of data for these. Okay, I mean, there you can come up with your own critiques of the first option that I just showed you, the revealed preferences. So I'm not going to belabor these, but most aspects of life are not priced, and there are interactions between the conditions that we live outside of our market lives and the ones inside the market, and it is those market decisions, market values, which are easiest to measure. And in addition, social costs are not well taken into account, and so we end up with problems like climate change, of course, on the larger scale. But slightly more subtly, as I've already mentioned, and I'm going to show you, people may not just be making a mistake in their decisions with respect to a social goal, a societal goal. They may even be making mistakes with respect to maximizing their own happiness. Again, there's a lot of literature on this now, and we could not have, there's really no way to have known this without the life satisfaction and subjective well-being data. Okay, what is this life satisfaction question I've been referring to? Here it is, the canonical version. Taking all things into account, how satisfied are you with your life these days on a scale of 0 to 10? All right, people amazingly are willing to answer this. They answer it quite quickly. There's a high response rate. To reiterate, note that this is not asking how are you feeling at the moment, also interesting, but different question. And it's not asking what do you think makes for a satisfying life. So generally, researchers like me who are measuring who are working with life satisfaction data or collecting these data don't care what people think is important for their life, because they may, in principle, be wrong. And so it is then up to the person working with all of the data to take the information about all the characteristics, aspects, conditions that we know for each individual's life and each individual's overall life satisfaction, and then we let the data tell us which things are associated with people being satisfied with their lives overall. Okay, now I've already mentioned a little bit, but we now know a fair bit about how people make these calculations. And to summarize it, I would say that people tend to be doing more or less what we would like them to be doing in answering such a difficult question. This is a similar question. It's also cognitive evaluation of life. I'm just putting it up there because these data for the whole globe are actually from that question. So here's average life evaluations around the world, and you can see some not surprising patterns. You can see very large variation. There's lots to say about this, but not here. Similar thing for the affect. I'm going to move along though. And let's look at a very simple-minded question, which is one that motivated economists to get into this field in the first place and still holds a lot of our attention, actually. But I'm going to tell you this question is too simple. And the question is, are people in richer countries happier? And this plot says the answer is absolutely. So on the horizontal axis here, I have average income per capita in each country, and you can see it's a log scale, which means there's a factor of 100 difference from here to here. And on the vertical scale is the average life satisfaction in each country. Each dot is one country. So you see, first of all, that income predicts life satisfaction fairly well, and that even at the rich end, people in richer countries are happier. In fact, if I were to say how much of the variation in a life evaluation can I explain with just income, I would say quite a bit. So it says something like 80% of the variation I explain. But what happens if I bring in some other variables as well? Okay, so if I now say, let me bring in a few more variables and ask how much they each explain. Now, income is still important, But so are these other social variables, and more so. So this first one is the degree to which people have friends and family to count on in times of trouble. The second one is a measure of health and life expectancy. The third is the degree to which people feel they have the freedom to choose the life they want. And here's another social embeddedness question, if you like. It's the amount of trust people have in their institutions. Now, this list of variables is somewhat limited by what is asked in the Gallup World Poll. We can do slightly better in some other surveys. And now look what happens if we do a similar kind of exercise for within a country. Okay. Here is the picture for Canada. So I'm again showing you income and life satisfaction. On the horizontal axis, we have mean household income in thousands of dollars per year. Vertical axis, life satisfaction. And lo and behold, we find a pattern that's just the opposite of what we saw across countries. The richer provinces are less happy. How can that be? Well, I'm now going to show you. I've carried out an exercise in which we can decompose the difference between, say, the least happy province, sorry BC, and the happiest, the Atlantic provinces. We can decompose that overall difference into portions that are explained by individual differences. So that's what this does. So the overall difference between BC and the Atlantic provinces is about 0.17 or so on a 10-point scale. Maybe sounds small, but it's actually it's a lot by relevant measures. In fact, we can explain all of that pretty well with just these few variables here. The first, the most important, is the degree to which people feel that they belong to their neighborhoods, belong to their cities, belong to their provinces, belong to their countries. The second is the frequency with which people are seeing their family and friends. Similarly important is the degree to which people have trust in their neighbors and indeed strangers. And this should be not immigrant, the degree to which people are not still undergoing the process of embedding themselves in their neighborhoods and building those relationships. Income, note, has a negative effect. Okay, so that's a bit complex, but this is, I would say, quite well understood. It's a huge literature, and this also reflects the degree to which we are very social beings, and that is because when we look around us, we actually get cues about norms for consumption, for material standard of living, which when they are higher, we feel less good about our own. Okay, you can put different words on that, whether it's jealousy or whether it's following, but this means that, and this is not a price effect, this is really what we call a relative income effect. And so the psychological benefit of material consumption is not all we feel it is, and is hampered by this very large social cost of high consumption. Not just on the environment, but in fact on the psychology of others. Now let me just sort of pictorially summarize how I now see the world and come at every problem as a result of a lot of social psychology and economic studies. And the first is that the first thing comes to mind for me when I think about what is motivating people is group identity. Okay, there's a lot of literature detailing how incredibly powerful this is. But it's not just important for behavior, it's important for well-being, for outcomes. And so the degree to which people feel embedded, engaged, meaningfully part of group goals and group activities is hugely important in any context: neighborhood, family, workplace, and up nations, so all social structures. And similarly, we know these other measures of social capital, the degree to which people trust, are engaged. And very interestingly, and we could not have gotten this insight without the life satisfaction data or subjective well-being data, is the degree to which people are allocating the resources to help others. And there's a series of experiments, in part led by UBC's own Liz Dunn in the psychology department, looking at the fact that if you actually restrict people's options, or if you give them a nudge so that they are allocating their time or resources to help others more than they would given their own best idea of what's going to make them happy, then their outcomes are better. They end up happier than if you had not pushed them in that direction of doing what you might call altruistic behavior. Okay, I promised to show you some cases where people seem to be making mistakes. And I just referred to one, in fact, that we often underestimate the value, the selfish value, if you like, of altruistic behavior. But here's another, and this looks at, this is related to the structure of neighborhoods and communities, if you like. And this relates to the very complex coupled decision between a choice of a workplace and a job, of a home, and of the commute between them. Okay, so there's a trade-off between larger home, smaller home, higher paying job, and the cost of that sometimes is the distance between them. And so on the bottom axis here, the label is a bit cut off, is the commuting time in minutes, one way. And this is actually just a descriptive plot showing that people with higher commutes are less happy. But these data were very rich. This is from Germany, and the survey followed people over time. And so they were actually able to make deep inferences about whether or not people had optimized properly in that decision, or whether they could have actually ended up happier if they had made a slightly different set of choices. And the summary conclusion of the work is that people are commuting too long. So when they are making this couple decision of where to live and so on, they are underestimating the psychological cost of commuting, or they're underestimating, directly or indirectly, they're underestimating the value of having time, say, at home with family to keep up other parts of life, and they may be overestimating the value, for instance, of salary and of getting a particularly rewarding job in that regard. Let me mention another study, and I've just got a couple more studies like this I want to take you through, which is to do with a similar topic of affective, so psychologists call this affective forecasting, the degree to which we can predict psychological outcomes of our own choices or of future situations. So this is a very nice natural experiment that relies on a literal lottery that happens when first-year students arrive at Harvard. And in the first year, everyone has to live in a dorm around Harvard Yard, and there's an actual lottery to decide which to place people in different dorms. And so these researchers went in and surveyed the students before the lottery results were revealed, and asked, where would you like to live? In fact, how happy will you be in a year's time if you were assigned to each of the different dorms, and why? And they came back in a year, and everybody had established their lives in one place or one dorm or another, and they found out how people are actually doing. And the findings were that people had expected what you might call superficial characteristics of these different future possibilities. They'd emphasized the importance of that feature in their future outcomes. All right. In fact, what made all the difference, this is the theme from in what I'm telling you, is the degree to which they had embedded found a community and found friends, and maybe even been assigned somewhere where their friends were. And so the interesting part is not just that the latter aspect, the latter features of life are more important than the material circumstances, at least in this level of affluence, but that people had made a mistake in that judgment. And so again, for architecture, for community planning, this has implications in that there are opportunities to either to nudge people or to inform them about what outcomes are, and also at the same time there are lessons here, of course, about the great importance in design of building spaces that bring people together and that forge these repeated social interactions and connections. And possibly have less emphasis on the superficial material look of things. A theme that I'll be coming back to at the end is that we're often focused on a subset of these outcomes and not enough on the process and the social processes that come along with it. Just to reflect on this and the previous story I told you, there are some decisions in life in which we don't get a lot of experience. We only, have a family once or twice. We only make this couple decision between a job and a workplace and a home a few times, and so it's very difficult to learn how to optimize. And so part of this literature says, well, we basically have to learn from the previous generation, and indeed, either they tell us what they think would have been better, or better yet, nowadays we actually have life satisfaction data, and we can say, these are the kinds of choices that are going to make you happier on the long term, and that's novel. Okay, one more very neat experiment here. This concerns a group of elderly residential care residents who were moving into a new building, and the building had 2 floors without much mobility between them, and so there's an opportunity to do an experiment by an intervention on one of the floors and not the other. And what's amazing about this paper is that the intervention they made was tiny. So in the upstairs, they simply engaged the residents in some what you might call superficial decisions, some small decisions about the decor. Okay, so which painting or which kind of painting should we have over there? What color should this wall be? Color of the drapes, maybe. Whereas in the control case in the downstairs, those decisions were made by the staff as usual. So the outcomes were not especially better qualitatively upstairs. They simply had involved the participation, the engagement as a group of the residents. The outcomes were really quite striking. So the use of group space doubled, but subjective well-being levels were higher in this treated group. And even more amazingly, the objective metrics also went very significantly up in comparison to the control group. And cognitive functioning was higher, as were health outcomes and ultimately longevity. So again, the story here for neighborhood and community building is that there are sustained benefits all across the board, just by having the right approach to engagement and building a sense of identity in a place and with a group. And you can do that. There's a series of studies now in which interventions like this are done, in particular in elder care situations, in which group activity, group engagement has huge impacts on health and well-being. So I actually think that given our demographic challenges, healthcare challenges, there are huge opportunities for innovation in bringing generations together in the years to come with, as I say, benefits all around. Okay, last quick story here. You'll have to look this up for details so I can keep on time. But since 2008, the Singapore Prison Service really revamped their entire outlook, modus operandi, and objective. And rather than they moved their whole framework from one of sort of damage control, dealing with a problem, rehabilitation, so even just rehabilitation, to one of which they're really trying to create well-being for everybody, so that for inmates, for staff, and for the local community. And it's really an amazing experiment and transformation, and it's an example in which it sort of parallels the shift to positive psychology, to thinking about health differently, and to thinking about well-being in economics, in that if you are aware of and measuring positive outcomes and you design for them, you can reap enormous benefits which were just waiting for us in past institutions. All right, let me wrap up now. I'm not quite done, but let me wrap up by talking about the bigger picture, policy and metrics. What's actually being done to sort of at the policy level to measure life satisfaction and other measures of well-being. And to start, this is now has the attention of people really at top levels in government, from David Cameron, who's interested in subjective well-being before he became Prime Minister. Nicolas Sarkozy initiated a Stiglitz Commission to look at alternative measures of well-being, including life satisfaction. Even Ben Bernanke has spoken on this topic. And President Park in South Korea also is still in the process of undergoing a real reorientation of policy towards measures of happiness. And she also hires rap singers for her inauguration. And indeed, the UN is now producing every year or two. We'll see a World Happiness Report since 2012. So these are all very prominent endeavors that are trickling up and down the political spectrum and into and from economics as well, economic thinking. Now, I want to try and give you my classification of all these different new, what you might call alternative well-being measures that we see at all different geographic scales, because there is a variety of them, and there's two opposing views that you might imagine. One is, well, happiness is important, but it's not all that's important. It's not everything. And on the other hand, if you list, and I say happiness here loosely, let's say even life satisfaction, alongside some other things, let's say sometimes you'll have people listing life satisfaction is important and income is important, then the counter-argument is, well, income is already a causative factor of life satisfaction. It's taken into account to the appropriate extent in people's responses in life satisfaction. So why are we also listing it for its own sake? Okay, so there's still freedom to choose on this spectrum of what one wants to consider in an actual set of indicators. So let me just give a quick taxonomy of sort of what's out there. And the first set looks like GDP. These are the counting measures in which everything is converted to a dollar value. Okay, so these are really augmented GDP, where we start to bring in, for instance, ecological values, natural capital, but also if one can quantify and if one can express in monetary amounts, even possibly things like social capital, right? If social capital pays dividends in the future, then maybe we should be thinking of building up social capital as an investment on par with other kinds of investments. So there are genuine progress indicator efforts. You generally see them turning over or going down while GDP happily progresses upwards. And those there are a number of those around the world. So the second classification here is the one that I've been focusing on. Life satisfaction itself is a simple single measure, and so you get findings like this comparing again growth to life satisfaction. A big step has been taken by the OECD a year ago in issuing a set of guidelines for national statistical agencies and anybody else up and down the geographic scale who wants to start implementing subjective well-being measures. So I mentioned there's life satisfaction, there's affect, and there's one other category of subjective well-being that OECD has included, but this is a guideline for really starting to standardize how we measure these things. It's very well written and worth a read if you're interested in implementing such a thing. Now the remainder of efforts out there to come up with well-being measures go under indices and then collections categories. So an index, I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, is the case when a bunch of things which shouldn't be combined into a single number are combined into a single number. Okay, that's my view. So if you have a set of domains of life that you think are important as part of your social progress indicator or well-being indicator, you can add them all up, usually with equal weights, which is out of nowhere. And the problem with this, it's very difficult. There's no empirical accountability to those weights, and so it's hard to explain what the measure means, and so it's very hard for any policymaker to take it very seriously. I think that's the problem with the Human Development Index, for instance. There's also a similar measure which has a bunch of domains that are aggregated together, also available in partially disaggregated, but in the Canadian Index of Wellbeing. Now, there's something else which doesn't exist yet, but I think it may in the future, and I would be an advocate of it, and that's a synthetic life satisfaction index. And so here this is similar to what I just mentioned, except that the weights for the different components as they're added together to make a single number would come from inference from the life satisfaction data. So the life satisfaction data show, and I've shown you this, they tell us how important different domains of life, different objectives are, one with respect to the other. And so we could use those weights and build something that has essentially the units of a 10-point life satisfaction scale, but actually is informed by other things which we can measure more precisely and individually to give the breakdown. This, I think, has a lot of appeal. The value of the indices in general is that as a single number it has a traction that, say, GDP does. Okay, but I've told you the downside of if you have people can understand the GDP, they know there's a logic behind it. These arbitrary weighted indices have that problem for buy-in. Now, everybody else in this category is not aggregating their different domains completely, and so they leave you a set of domains to look at individually. So Bhutan, which actually decades ago the king coined this term gross national happiness, but for a long time they weren't doing anything about it. Well, now they are, and they've jumped to the fore in it. So they are measuring now. They have 9 domains, I believe, and so they are measuring these metrics. And if you want to know how life is going in Bhutan, there's no simple answer of it's getting better or worse. You really have to dig into the details, but the focus is on this set of this collection of indicators. The OECD also has a somewhat similar approach. Let me just show you. If you go to oecd.org/progress, you find this very neat interface where here are the domains which are listed as important, and you can choose the weight on each one. All right, so this allows, and as you choose the weights, that changes the length of the petals on each of these flowers, which each corresponds to one country. So you can see with the weights I've chosen here, we have Australia, and then Denmark and Canada, and Norway are the top. If we change these weights, we'd get different overall rankings for this index that's constructed. Now, this allows them to be agnostic on what the weights are. Cleverly, it also allows them to accumulate data from visitors to the website who choose the weights that they most like. So they've made use of that. All right. Now let me. This is I think my second to last slide. I just third. I just want to point out that there is a growing number, very recently now, of local communities who are interested in building, who are building well-being indicators or metrics like the ones I've just shown. And in most cases, they're finding that the data available using National Statistical Agency objective data, if you like, are not sufficient. They need to complement them with things like subjective well-being and extra measures of social capital. And so that means that they're implementing their own surveys. So Jacksonville, Florida is an early innovator in this regard, but now there are very prominent efforts in Somerville, Santa Monica, Victoria had a survey in 2010 and 2011 as well. So, and there are several others up and coming. I think this is a way of the future. So you can look at these if you're interested in such efforts. Here's Somerville's cover page. Okay. Finishing up, what are the big picture prescriptions that come out of what we've learned about life from life satisfaction? Here's one set that I like quite a bit. The first policy prescription is still to measure more, because we've learned that once you have a measure that's important, that you realize is valuable, you need to increase the amount of data, and not just well-being, but also the primary drivers that we've learned about well-being, which are generally undermeasured. We know that unemployment is very important compared to the way it is currently or naturally emphasized in our economic system. Unemployment is very bad for life satisfaction. Listed shifting our use of time. Everything to do with active engagement and community engagement, we know is hugely important. I've mentioned a couple of contexts in which people seem to be misallocating their resources and their time, making decisions which are not maximizing their own subjective well-being. One reason you can imagine such a thing to be the case is, of course, that we are bombarded by messages, advertising messages, telling us what is going to make us happier. And so that, I think this is a huge policy domain to be addressed still, as to whether it is fair to tell people messages, to give people affective forecasting information that is not true, essentially. And health is the theme from preventive health and from positive psychology, that we need to think, focus on complete health. If there are any ideas more specific for neighborhoods still, I would say the following things. One theme I hope you've heard today is that process matters. So we tend to be overly focused on a set of outcomes, and that may not be the most important thing to have focused on in retrospect. Secondly, as I mentioned, if we can nudge people, give people opportunities, encourage them to work together, not just in a group, but not just with others, but for others, it appears that there are benefits for everyone involved, even including very much the doers. And there's also strong evidence that people, at least in Canada, are underestimating the level of trustworthiness of others and levels of safety. And so here's a case where we may, with objective data on our side, be able to shift people's perceptions and therefore participation in communities. And lastly, I've given you some examples, such as the Singapore prison service, in which when we think about problems, we need to turn them around and look for ways to make them into labs and generators of well-being for everybody. So with that, I look forward to your questions. I hope these comments have been relevant to regenerative neighborhoods. I actually need to finish, with one more thing, which is to say that in my description of if I've given you a hint of my preferences for what an overarching indicator of well-being would be, I have written about the fact that subjective life satisfaction, nobody ever claims that people's responses to life satisfaction questions take into account those who are not voting, in other words, future generations, or those who can't speak, other species and ecosystems, natural systems, nor, in other words, the far future, or the social environmental costs of in full, nor do they take into account the things which we do not know about our social costs. And so I imagine my ideal set of indicators for progress would not just be the social ones that I'm focusing on in this talk, and those would be led by an overarching life satisfaction indicator, then with a set of supporting domains underneath it with all the details. But in parallel to that, we of course need a separate set of indicators for the natural systems and the long-term sustainability, and those and so that's a separate topic, and I do not mean to exclude that by using the word progress the way I have. Okay, with that, I look very much forward to some discussion. Thank you.